Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs magazine wrote a critique of the show Rising with Krystal and Saagar. Now, before I continue, let me say up front that I actually like Nathan J. Robinson quite a bit. He wrote what I think is maybe the best piece I've ever read on Noam Chomsky. Just hit the perfect note, and I really related to it, so I'd highly recommend checking out Nathan J. Robinson's article on Noam Chomsky in Current Affairs magazine. He also wrote a superb piece on Jordan Peterson. That's another one that I highly recommend you check out. And listen, I've promoted Current Affairs before. I think I tweeted out, hey, this is support their work, and here's the link. And so that's how much I like Nathan J. Robinson, and I like Current Affairs. But this piece he did on Rising, let's just say I don't view it like I view the Noam Chomsky one and like I view the Jordan Peterson one. So here's the title of the Rising piece he wrote. Isn't right-wing populism just fascism? So the gist of his argument is that Krystal's good. I like Krystal, but Saagar I thought was good. Turns out, no, Saagar's bad. I don't like Saagar. And I think that Saagar's actually terrible now, and Krystal is enabling the terribleness of Saagar, and it seems like an argument. I don't know whether he explicitly says it or doesn't say it, but I think his underlying point is like the show shouldn't exist because the left should have the left should have nothing to do with the populist right, or like the populist left should have nothing to do with the populist right because, quote, isn't right-wing populism just fascism? And the gist of his argument is this. Oh, let's have a conversation about right-wing populism. Here, let me list some. Bolsonaro of Brazil, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson. And then, of course, he has to throw in there Mussolini and Hitler when talking about right-wing populists. And so his main claim is that, well, right-wing populism is all a fraud, and you should have nothing to do with them. And Krystal saw the criticism, and she did a segment on it responding. And, her argument was, what do you want me to do? When I'm sitting next to Saagar and Saagar says something I disagree with, I vehemently disagree with him, and we argue it out. And not only is it that sometimes I disagree with him, sometimes I think his beliefs are beyond the pale, and I say it to him that they're beyond the pale. Now, when we happen to agree, we have conversations where we agree. So basically, like, what do you want from me? And it seems like Krystal gets it from left-wingers sometimes who are like, how dare you sit next to Saagar? And then she gets it from right-wingers when they disagree with the substance of what she says, because she's arguing for left-wing positions. So her point is like, what do you want from me? And listen, I think the implication of what Nathan's saying is pretty clear. He doesn't want the show to exist. He doesn't want the show to exist, and he doesn't want the left to have anything to do with the populist right, because in his mind, the populist right are frauds, full stop. Now, what is populism? In order to have this conversation, we need to define what populism is. Well, populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. So it's just representing the will of ordinary people. Now, I would contend as well that when you talk about populism, populism is more limited to the scope of economic policy, economic domestic policy. In the same way that, like, when you hear the label neoconservative, it's not the same as, like, conservative. It's neoconservative, and that typically is more describing politics in the realm of foreign policy. Well, populism is more about domestic economic policy, and it's representing the will of ordinary people on that front. Okay, so first of all, that's the definition of it. Now, where would I agree with Nathan? Okay, I would agree that almost every single national leader who calls themselves a right-wing populist or has been broadly given the label a right-wing populist. They're frauds. I think Tucker Carlson is pretty much a fraud. Every now and then he says the right thing about stopping outsourcing jobs, or that one time he agreed with AOC and Bernie about, let's limit the amount of interest that banks can charge. Like, every now and then he'll throw out war is bad or whatever. But yes, the overwhelming majority of the time, he's just taking standard conservative positions. And when he's not taking conservative positions, the rhetoric does not match up with the reality of the politicians he supports. So you could say that you're anti-establishment, but then when you support Trump, who is now doing the bidding of the establishment, are you really anti-establishment? No. I can say that's fraudulent. I'm comfortable saying he's a fraud. I'm comfortable saying almost every national leader that would be called a right-wing populist is a fraud. The best example that we can go to is this guy named Josh Hawley. He's the Republican senator who most closely embodies the philosophy of right-wing populism. Now, why is he given that label? Because when it comes to some domestic economic policy issues, he bucks orthodoxy, at least in rhetoric. So, like, he will argue flat out against so-called free trade. He's done it within the past couple of years. He'll come out there and argue against the concept of free trade, argue for more protectionism. He argued for doing what Germany did with our wages. I believe it was him and Representative Pramila Jayapal, who's of course a Democrat and a lefty. They argued for temporarily nationalizing wages for small businesses. So yes, in some ways, his economic approach is certainly not that of the hardcore libertarians who are totally in favor of every free trade deal and who would never want to nationalize wages for small businesses. He's the closest thing that you could say represents a right-wing economic or a right-wing populist in the country in terms of a national leader. Now, here's why I think he's a fraud. If you look through his record, his voting record doesn't match his rhetoric. Are you sensing a trend here? Whether it's Donald Trump or whoever who's so-called populist right, they end up doing standard establishment politics. So for Josh Hawley, he supported the balanced budget amendment, which you will, in no way, shape, or form, could you do like any social safety net, or you'd at the very least have to strictly reduce the social safety net if you have a balanced budget amendment. That is not populist at all. He says the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is unconstitutional. I don't think you could call yourself a populist and be against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whose job is literally to protect regular Americans from big financial institutions ripping them off. So, yeah, that's a hard case to make there. Oh, I'm a populist, but I'm against the CFPB. He's also for right-to-work laws, which is anti-union legislation. That is definitely not populist. One of the cornerstones of populism would be for the workers, namely for unions. Another one is he's not even for Obamacare, never mind Medicare for all. A real populist, you'd have to say would have to be for Medicare for all, because that's one of the biggest economic burdens Americans face is healthcare costs, and the overwhelming majority of the population, even in some polls, most Republicans want Medicare for all. He's not even for Obamacare, never mind Medicare for all. And also, by the way, this one's the nail in the coffin, in my opinion. Josh Hawley supported the 2017 Republican tax cuts for the rich. Don't tell me you're an economic populist, dog, because every now and then you go out there and say, yeah, free trade is bad, protectionism is good, and maybe we should nationalize wages because of COVID, or do UBI or whatever. No. On very few issues, he bucks orthodoxy, and most of the time he bucks orthodoxy, it's mostly in rhetoric, not in terms of substance. So that's where I would agree with Nathan. If he were to make the case that, hey, right-wing populism in terms of the national leadership, it's not real. There are no real elected right-wing populists. I would agree with Nathan. In fact, I'd probably be pushing that article that he wrote in the same way I pushed the Chomsky one and pushed the Jordan Peterson one. So, but he didn't make that argument. The argument went a hell of a lot further than that. So here's where Nathan is wrong. The idea that the populist left and the populist right cannot meet where they actually agree. And actually, let me establish that the populist right is a real thing first, because it is. It is so flippant, and sorry, Nathan, but it's true, so dumb to immediately go to Mussolini and Hitler when talking about right-wing populists. My dude, they are fascists. They are fascists. Right-wing populism is not just fascism. Like I told you, the definition of populism, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups. So here's an example of a right-wing populist. You ready? And there are many of them in terms of regular people all around the country. Not the leadership, who I agree are mostly frauds. There are plenty of right-wing populists all around the country. So what's a right-wing populist? A right-winger, somebody who describes themselves as a right-winger, and they're in favor of unions. They're in favor of stopping these terrible trade deals that outsource jobs and maybe reversing some of those trade deals. They're in favor of a living wage. They're in favor of Medicare for all. But they happen to disagree with us on the issue of affirmative action, on the issue of immigration, on the issue of abortion. That's somebody who I would call a right-wing populist. And that, my friend, is a significant chunk of the American population. Significant chunk. You want to know why? I see the polls. The polls are crystal clear. When you have most polls showing that the majority of Americans, every poll at this point shows the majority of Americans support Medicare for all. Some polls show a majority of Republicans support Medicare for all. Are there people in this country that are genuinely socially conservative but economically leftist? Yes! So what does Nathan do? When you say populist right politics, it's just a fraud, and let's talk about Mussolini and Hitler, what you're saying is let's take all these regular people who are not remotely near freaking fascists, you're smearing them and basically accusing them of fascism. And that is, I think, such sloppy thinking. And it's really sad because Nathan Robinson is a smart dude, and I would not expect this kind of sloppy thinking from him. Yes, Nathan, at the national level, most leaders who call themselves populist right or have been described as populist right, they're frauds because really, ultimately, they do standard establishment politics. But no, the whole concept of being populist right is not equivalent to fascism, and they're not all frauds. There are plenty of regular Americans who I would call populist right and who the polls would show are populist right. So let me answer Nathan's question. And this is kind of to reiterate what Krystal Ball was saying in her segment on this when she responded to it. Take yes for an answer when somebody agrees with you, dude. If somebody says, hey, I'm with you on Medicare for all, you know what you do? You say, great, let's get Medicare for all. Now, when that same person says, I'm against a right to choose in all circumstances, there should be 0 abortions, you go, okay, on that, not only am I not going to work with you, I'm going to fight you every step of the way. That's what I'm going to do. You understand? Oh, you're against gay rights? Well, I totally disagree with you on that. And I will destroy you in an argument on that. And I will not align with you on that. And where we disagree, my answer is hell no. I'm not giving an inch, bitch. But when we agree, why would I say on an issue where you agree with somebody, no, I refuse to agree because there are other issues where we don't agree? What are you, 5? Is that how we approach politics? No, that's not how we approach politics. And Bernie Sanders showed us the way. How many times have there been alliances between the left and libertarians where they agree? Criminal justice reform, NSA spying, ending the wars. Should Bernie not have worked with Mike Lee to try to stop the genocide in Yemen because Mike Lee has really bad views on immigration? He's a really bad guy. So they're frauds, don't have anything to do with them. If you say don't have anything to do with them, that means also don't have anything to do with them on Yemen where you agree with them. I hate this mindset. I hate this approach. I honestly think it's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. Because you want to know why? Everybody seems to understand, or most people seem to understand, when you talk about how the left and so-called moderate Democrats should get along on issues where we agree, everybody goes, well, duh, because you agree on those issues. The fact that Biden would pick a Supreme Court justice that's to the left of who Trump would pick, the fact that Biden would pick somebody like Merrick Garland, who's a centrist, and Trump keeps picking all these, far-right justices who just happened to break recently, by the way, but, Trump is going to pick further right justices than Joe Biden. Why am I allowed to say I agree with Joe Biden on that over Trump, or I agree with Joe Biden on gay rights, or I agree with Joe Biden, let's not pull out of the Iran deal when Trump pulled out of the Iran deal. Why am I allowed to say that and that's okay when Joe Biden is a war criminal? Joe Biden's a war criminal. He has the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent people on his hands. So he supported the Iraq war. So why, if Nathan was being consistent, he would say the left should have nothing to do with any moderate Democrats. Why? Because according to his conception of the world, they're frauds. He's a war criminal, case closed, so then even on the issues where you agree with him, you can't work with him and you can't say that you agree with him. See, notice how it only cuts one way. It only cuts one way. Everybody understands, well, duh, the areas where you agree with the moderate Democrats, whether it's gay rights, abortion, social issues, court picks, well, obviously we agree on that and we'll work with them on that because, duh, we agree with them. But when it comes to Saagar, and Saagar says, hey, I agree with you guys, let's stop outsourcing jobs, Nathan's response to that is, you're a fascist, you're a fraud, and I want to have nothing to do with you. See, with this approach to politics, you get literally nothing ever done. And you burn every single frickin' bridge. And he refuses to acknowledge, and there are a lot of people who refuse to acknowledge this simple concept, this simple notion. You're allowed to say yes when we agree, and no when we disagree, and even beyond that, yes when we agree, and no, and your beliefs are abysmal, abhorrent, and beyond the pale when we really disagree. So I really think it's sloppy thinking to argue that there's no such thing as populist right. The whole concept is tainted and ridiculous. And to the extent it exists, it's this group of insanely terrible people, Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen, Mussolini, and Hitler. And so you're equating regular Americans who are like for Medicare for all, for a living wage, for unions, but like against abortion and for immigration restrictions. You're equating them with the worst monsters in history. It's sloppy thinking, it's broad thinking, it's generalized thinking, and it's not even the same approach that you would take to dealing with moderate Democrats who might be war criminals. For some reason, the nuance is allowed for the moderate Democrats. The nuance is not allowed for the libertarians where you agree with them on war. And the nuance is not allowed for the populist right or paleo-conservatives where you would agree with them on trade. Take yes for an answer. When there are frauds who are pretending to be populist right but ultimately aren't, sure, call them out. By all means, I'll be right there with you. I just did it. I called out Josh Hawley's entire record. But to the extent that there are people that actually are populist right and actually do agree with you, of course you work with them on the issues where you agree. And you disagree on the issues where you disagree. And so it's just frustrating. And I actually feel kind of bad for Krystal. Because, like I said, there are plenty of lefties who are like, how dare you even have a show with somebody you disagree with on a lot of issues? And the argument is you're legitimizing him. But then she gets it from the other direction too. The right-wingers hate her because she argues for left-wing politics. So she's like, what the hell do you want me to do? See, Nathan thinks, and I'll end on this, okay? And you guys are not going to like this. So after Krystal did the segment responding to Nathan and saying, listen, man, that's not a fair criticism. Here's what we're actually trying to do here. We're not trying, there's no like nefarious ulterior motive. We do our show. We agree where we agree and we disagree where we disagree. That's what we do. Nathan says this. He doubles down. I have regretfully come to the conclusion that the Hill, owned by one of Trump's close personal friends, puts on Rising mainly for the purpose of trying to trick leftists into softening on Trump and see nationalist racists as preferable to moderate Democrats. What? That is absurd. That absolutely is not what they're doing. It's honestly laughable. Krystal herself was just saying, when Trump was threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, she was saying the same thing I was saying, which is like, oh my God, I might have to vote for Biden because this is way too far. See, what Nathan did there is he didn't like the response from Krystal, and so he resorted to, now I'm going to attack their motives. And so now it's a nefarious show, and the underlying goal is to like disengage the left and have the left see, racist right-wingers as preferable to lefties. First of all, no. Second of all, why couldn't the dynamic equally be the exact opposite? That, Saagar's presence on the show is really to get right-wingers to have more left-wing views, and it provides a gateway into socialism. See, that's the thing that these guys never acknowledge, never talk about, and it drives me crazy. There's all this talk about a gateway. Oh, it's a gateway to the far right. That's what this is serving as, gateway to the far right. If there's a gateway into something, you also understand there's a gateway out, correct? Correct? So if somebody's willing to say, hey, we agree that outsourcing jobs is bad. Oh, look, they're getting along on the issue. Let me see what else this person has to say who's on the left, while I, as a right-winger, watch the show. Why can't she deconvert people as much as Saagar can convert people to right-wing beliefs? See that you're not allowed to entertain. The pipeline in the gateway only works to go to the right. The pipeline in the gateway never goes left in their minds. Even though, by the way, it freaking does. It does. When you're intellectually honest enough to say we agree where we agree, you know what happens? A lot of people listen to you and they'll keep listening to you, and then over time you can change their mind. Which is why I guarantee you Krystal has changed more people's minds and made more people leftists than Nathan J. Robinson has. And that's not me taking a shot at Nathan J. Robinson. I just told you guys at the beginning of this how much I like him. But when your approach is, oh, all the populist right are just fascists and they're all frauds and let's talk about Hitler, what do you think is going to happen? Of course everybody's going to say, piss off, bro, if they're not already 100% in your little clique, in your subgroup. So, Nathan, I love you, man, but what are you doing? You're in a hole. Stop digging. She had a good response to you, and your response is, this is a trick to try to make lefties be okay with Trump. What are you talking about? By the way, I happen to know that, because I know both Saagar and Krystal, and maybe I'm not allowed to say this part. I probably shouldn't say this part publicly, but I'm more than happy to say it publicly. There are a lot of contentious issues. The idea that anybody over there is a puppet or has underlying nefarious motives, not remotely close. And in fact, management is not too happy with them quite often because of the kind of show that they're doing, which is unsurprising because they're genuine outsider voices on a platform that is not an outsider platform. As I've told you guys before, this show is deprioritized in the algorithm. My show, you know whose isn't? The Hill. Because it is owned by a corporation. And so they got through all the algorithm deprioritization stuff, and so they're this is why they grow so much faster than all the other lefty channels. They do a good show, but it's not just because they do a good show. It's recommended all over the place. So you don't think that people who are saying the things that they're saying, you don't think like management is like always on their last nerve with them? They are. I happen to know they are. So this idea that there's like, this grand plan where the puppet masters are pulling the strings and really we're using Krystal just to, make Trump and the Republicans look good, even though she always goes after them. It's, Nathan, what are you doing, man? It's sad. It's sad. I feel sad reading this. Even, I can't get over just the notion, just the idea that he's pushing out there, that the populist right doesn't exist. It's fraudulent. But to the extent it does exist, it's Hitler and Mussolini. What? So there's nobody out there who's a right-winger, for Medicare for all, for a living wage. I'm talking about regular voters now, not leaders. The leadership, I agree, are frauds. But there's no right-wingers who are for Medicare for all, for a living wage, for unions, against outsourcing, but they happen to be strict on immigration, right-wing on immigration, against abortion, against affirmative action. Of course people like that exist. Of course they do. And you know what an adult does, Nathan? They work with those people only on the issues where they agree, and they fight them tooth and nail where they disagree. So in other words, the same way I treat Joe Biden, where I say, sorry, but Biden would pick a better Supreme Court justice than Trump. That's obvious. Sorry, Biden would have stayed in the Iran deal and Trump pulled out of it, so Biden's better on that issue. you go down the list of the issues where Biden is better. In the same way, I can agree on that. And in the same way, I could say Biden wouldn't gut the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau like Trump did. But I can disagree with Biden where I disagree with him. The Iraq War, NAFTA, pushing TPP. I can go on and on here, right? Patriot Act. In the same way I treat Biden, where I agree where I agree and I disagree where I disagree, is the same way I treat the populist right. But Nathan wants to wholesale write off the populist right and only acknowledge nuance for somebody on our side who's a Democrat. It's just sloppy thinking, and it's just sad, especially coming from a guy as smart as Nathan. Again, I really like current affairs, and this is how nice of a guy I am. Even in a segment where I'm disagreeing with Nathan, I'm going to plug his magazine because I like him. He did the best Chomsky article I ever read and the best Jordan Peterson article I ever read. Please go read them. But Nathan, for the love of God, when you're in a hole, stop digging. You're wrong on rising. Sorry, but you just are.